In this lesson, we will cover what we will call fruit garden considerations. In our first lesson, we provided an overview of home fruit gardening. Now we will look at more specific recommendations on growing fruit under Kansas conditions. Two things that must be considered before putting in a fruit planting is the location and the pollination requirements of different fruit plants. We will start with location. Most fruit plants do best under full sunlight. If that is not possible, provide as much sunlight exposure as possible. Most fruit plants need a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of full sun a day for the plant to produce an acceptable fruit crop. Sunlight is needed for the tree to produce food for the fruit tree. Remember, photosynthesis makes sugar, which the plant uses for energy, that allows the plant to function, grow, and produce fruit. Sugar is also what gives the fruit its sweetness. Sugar that is not used for plant growth can be converted into other types of carbohydrates such as starch and stored to be used later. Fruit plants produce fruit buds for the next growing season during the current growing season. For example, an apple tree that is growing and maturing fruit in June is also making fruit buds for the next year. If an apple tree tries to mature too many fruit during the summer, there is no energy left to produce fruit buds for the next year. If no fruit buds are produced, then, of course, the tree will not produce fruit the following year. In years where no fruit is produced, the plant has more than enough energy to produce an excessive number of fruit buds. This leads to a condition known as Biennial Bearing, where an apple tree produces a very large crop one year and none the next. So how do you fix this? There are two ways. Pruning and mulch will help as buds are removed during the process. However, this is often not enough. Removing excess fruit through a process known as thinning can bring the tree back into balance. We will discuss thinning in more detail later. Finally, sunlight is also needed for fruit growth and color. This is especially noticeable with red apples. Those that are in the middle of the tree and therefore shaded often will not color well. Soil considerations must also be considered. Drainage is vital for the health of fruit plants. If the soil stays flooded with water for an extended period of time, fruit plants will die. Some trees, such as willows and cottonwoods, can survive for months under flooded conditions because they have the ability to move oxygen to the roots. Fruit plants do not have this ability and will be dead in about a week if the soil does not drain. One way to avoid drainage problems is to use raised beds. This may be done by using a bed shaper, as you see here. More permanent raised beds can be made by using timbers or by making berms. Organic matter can improve a soil so plants can grow well. As a rule, add 2 inches of organic matter to the surface of the soil and work in before planting small fruit. Planting a tree is a bit more involved, and we will discuss that in detail later. Remember that organic matter helps any soil. In a clay soil, adding organic matter increases aeration and the water infiltration rate. Increasing oxygen levels through aeration is vital for a healthy root system. Every living cell in a plant must have oxygen in order to survive. A lack of adequate oxygen can weaken and may kill root cells. Organic matter also helps increase pore space in a clay soil, which helps oxygen penetrate deeper and in higher concentrations. The water infiltration rate is a measure of how quickly rain or irrigation can soak into a soil. If the infiltration rate is low, rain may run off rather than soaking into the soil. In a sandy soil, organic matter acts as a sponge and holds water and nutrients. Soil pH must be in a certain range in order for plants to grow well. So what is pH and why is it important? The pH is a measure of how alkaline or acid something is. It is a scale that runs from 0, which is extremely acid, to 14, which is extremely alkaline. This is a logarithmic scale. Therefore, a pH of 6 is 10 times as acid as a pH of 7. A pH of 5 is 100 times as acid as a pH of 7, and a pH of 4 is 1,000 times as acid as a pH of 7. So a 1-point change in pH represents a 10-fold increase or decrease in acidity or alkalinity. Soils normally run from a pH of 4 to 8.5 or even higher. I have seen pH readings in the low 9s. Most fruit plants are in the sweet spot at a range of 6.0 to 6.5. Some fruit plants can have a wider sweet spot than this. Also, fruit plants can usually tolerate pH outside their sweet spot, though they grow best within it. So why is pH important? This graph represents the availability of certain nutrients to plants. Note that this shows how available a nutrient is, not how much is in the soil. Let's look at nitrogen. There is the same amount of nitrogen in the soil at pH of 5 as there is at 6. However, the plant has more difficulty grabbing the nitrogen at a pH of 5 than a pH of 6. If you look at this graph, you can see that most nutrients are highly available at a pH between 6.0 and 6.5. Therefore, this is the range we shoot for when growing most fruit plants. This table shows the optimum range of pH for various fruit plants. Notice that some fruits, such as blackberry, have a wide range, while others, such as apple, have a narrow range. If you look through this list, you will see that a pH of 6.0 to 6.5 is in the optimum range for all fruit crops listed. So how do you change pH? If the pH is too low, add ground limestone. If too high, then add sulfur, peat moss, iron sulfate, or aluminum sulfate. The pellets you see here are sulfur pellets that will dissolve back into a sulfur dust when wet. In Kansas, our soils tend to be on the high side, or alkaline, but a soil test is needed to be sure. Pollination requirements vary with the species for a fruit plant. Anyone recognize this plant? This is a blueberry, and the bee isn't a honeybee but a bumblebee. Most people assume that honeybees are the primary pollinator for fruit, and for most species this is true. However, blueberries have a constriction at the bottom of the flower that keeps most honeybees out. Bumblebees, on the other hand, have a long enough mouth part that they can reach the pollen without entering the flowers. Though most nut crops are wind-pollinated, fruit plants are usually pollinated by bees. There are exceptions, such as pawpaw that is pollinated by beetles and flies. As a matter of fact, some people who grow pawpaws will hang roadkill in a pawpaw tree to attract flies. Bees show no interest in pawpaw. Most people show no interest in roadkill. Certain fruit plants, such as apples, require cross-pollination. In other words, you must have two different varieties of the same species to get much fruit. Let me give an example. If you have one Jonathan apple, you won't get much fruit. If you have two Jonathan apples, you still won't get much fruit. However, if you have a Jonathan and a Red Delicious apple, you have a good crop on both. Again, you must have two different varieties of the same species to get much fruit if cross-pollination is required. This is a listing of fruit species that require cross-pollination and include sweet cherries, Japanese plums, pears, and winesap apples. Most apples and European plums find cross-pollination helpful, but may still bear some fruit without it. Also, there are exceptions to the rule. For example, Golden Delicious apples, Stella sweet cherry, and Kiefer pears do not require cross-pollination. Plants that do not require cross-pollination can pollinate themselves. Therefore, you only need one plant to get a crop. Self-pollinating crops include apricots, peaches, nectarines, blackberries, raspberries, tart cherries, grapes, and strawberries. As a rule, small fruit are self-fruitful. Blueberries are an exception and do require cross-pollination, but are not commonly grown in Kansas. Since fruit are pollinated by bees, bee effectiveness is important. Bees like warm, dry, and calm conditions and dislike cold, wet, and windy. They also prefer a distance of 100 feet or less between fruit plants, and a distance of 500 feet can prevent pollination. Bees prefer plants close to the ground, such as dandelions and clover, so they can avoid wind. However, these plants usually bloom later than our fruit plants, and so this is rarely a problem. What if you don't have a tree for pollination? There are several ways to deal with this. The first, of course, is to plant a second tree of a different cultivar. However, it will be a number of years before this tree is old enough to bloom. In the meantime, see if you can take prunings from a neighbor's tree to pollinate yours. Place the prunings in a bucket under your tree and change the prunings and the water in the bucket every couple of days. Alternatively, you could graft a second tree of a different variety on yours. Actually, it'd be wise to make several grafts of the second variety onto your tree. Just pick some branches that are low enough to make grafting toward the tips easy. The tricky part, once the grafts are made, is to make sure you don't prune them off in later years. Having your fruit plants close to water is important in Kansas. Though some areas receive enough total rainfall for fruit, the distribution is often such that irrigation is needed. This is especially important as the trees become established. It takes at least a couple of years before the root system has recovered from the transplant process. There are a number of methods used to irrigate fruit, but I prefer drip irrigation. There is less loss due to evaporation as the water soaks into the soil. Also, only the plants are watered with the aisles remaining dry. Drip irrigation lines can be up to 250 feet long and still maintain uniformity of application, and as much as 1,000 feet of drip tubing can be supported from a garden hose, depending on the spacing of the emitters. Fruits that can be of concern, especially with apples. Not only are we concerned with a lack of fruit set, but also too much. Fruit trees have a limit to the number of fruit that can mature in one season. Normally, we want about 1 apple for every 6 to 8 inches of branch. The branch in the middle of this photograph has way too many fruit, while the one on the right is much better. We will talk about thinning fruit later. Remember, the fruit comes from fruit buds that were developed the previous year. Fruit buds may develop before, during, or after this year's fruit crop, depending on the species. This photo is of blueberries. Notice the difference between the size of the fruit buds and the leaf buds. The very large buds are for fruit, and the very small ones are for the leaves. Here we see when fruit buds develop for various fruits. Note that apple produces fruit buds at the same time as maturing this year's fruit crop. For example, during June of this year, the apple is not only maturing fruit for harvest, but is also producing buds for next year's fruit crop. If there is too much fruit on the tree, all the tree's energy goes into maturing this year's fruit, and none is left over for producing fruit buds for the next year. The next year there won't be any apples, and so there is more than enough energy to produce far too many fruit buds. This leads to a problem with biennial bearing. In other words, a cycle of lots of fruit one year and none the next. Apples are the fruit that is most affected by this, but we can also see it with pear and peach. We don't worry about biennial bearing with cherries or the small fruits, so there is no need to thin these fruits. Notice that cherries set fruit buds after this year's fruit crop has been harvested anyway. Also take note that strawberries set fruit buds in September and October. Most people have forgotten all about their strawberries at this time of year, but this is actually when they need the best care. Watering, thinning, and fertilizing in the fall will do more to increase the next year's spring crop than anything you can do during that spring season. One of the questions that often asked by homeowners is why my tree didn't have fruit. We've already mentioned biennial bearing, late spring frosts, and a lack of a pollinating variety being problems, but there are several other possible reasons. The tree may not be old enough to bear. Often it takes several years before a fruit tree is mature enough to set fruit. Gardeners have to be patient. Also, some fruit are sensitive to extremely cold winter temperatures. For example, peach fruit buds start to be killed at -10 degrees. Leaf buds, and therefore the tree is fine, but fruit set is reduced or eliminated. Thornless blackberry canes can also be damaged at about -10 degrees. The plant will put up new canes, so the plant is okay, but you won't get fruit for that year. Poor bee activity due to cold, wet weather, as well as poor nutrition and disease, may reduce, but rarely eliminates, fruit. Another question you often get is how to propagate fruit by seed. Usually what people really want to know is, how do I get a tree just like Grandpa's? No one knows what variety it is, and so I just can't buy another one. Growing another tree from seed will not work, as it won't be just like the parent. Remember, in meiosis, all the genetic material is jumbled up so that each tree that comes from seed will be a bit different than the parent. The photo you see here is of a red delicious apple and an apple from a tree that grew from seed from a red delicious apple. You can see that the second apple is smaller and the coloration is a bit different than the true red delicious. About 1 in 80,000 apples grown from seed will be commercial quality. So how do you produce an apple just like the parent? You have to vegetatively propagate the tree through a process known as grafting. Grafting is a process where you can join two different plants to make one. The plants must be closely related for this to work. The part that makes up the root system is called the rootstock. In some fruit, the rootstock is chosen to keep the tree smaller. These are called dwarfing rootstocks. The top portion of the tree is known as the scion. This is the part of the tree that produces fruit. Examples of apple scions would include Jonathan, Honeycrisp, Gala, etc. This is a line drawing of how an apple tree can be grafted. This is a whip and tongue graft that anyone can do with a little training. There are also grafting kits that include a grafting tool and all the materials needed to graft except the plant material. This makes grafting very simple without the need to develop your technique. Well, that finishes this lesson on fruit garden considerations. Next, we'll look at individual fruit crops.